we've actually been taught that what is important and what is news is issues that are really relevant to a often affluent, highly educated, politically connected class of people. The things that they're interested in are the most important news stories of the day. And that if you're writing for that class, then that's how you make your name as a journalist, because that's how most news organizations have structured their business, is really around serving that small subset of people.
That's Mazin, one of the co-founders of Documented, a newsroom that was designed from the ground up to serve immigrant communities in New York City.
What he's describing there, the idea that what is considered newsworthy is shaped by a small elite audience, is something that we've been thinking a lot lately. Because if we say that we do journalism that's in the public interest, and if we say we do journalism that exposes wrongdoing and holds powerful people, institutions, and corporations accountable for their actions, but the people who are most affected by what the findings expose, the people who live this reality every day, can never access what we reported, then who did we do it for?
Right, because too often investigations that expose important public information end up behind paywalls in newspapers people don't have subscriptions for, or written in technical language, or even published in formats that just don't fit how people access information, especially if they're people who are working multiple jobs, who don't trust mainstream media, or speak a different language.
Ultimately, if we think about this concept of accountability journalism, which is what we were just describing there, it's meant to be a service to the public, to put information in the hands of people who could eventually hold those companies or those individuals accountable and correct that power imbalance. But often journalists think that just because the journalism exists, it will naturally provide that service or reach the people that it needs. But in the context that you just described, Beatriz, where people are super busy, people might not have access to everything, or maybe people only see the news on vertical video platforms, it could run the risk of ending up as this luxury product that only the people who have a lot of time to read long reads can access. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about what it actually means to serve a community or serve the public through journalism. And how can journalists make sure that the people who are most affected by an issue that they're reporting on, are the ones who can access and act on the findings?
This episode is going to be broken into 3 parts. First up, we're going to speak to Cynthia.
My name is Cynthia Gichiri. I am a multimedia journalist based in Nairobi, Kenya. I currently work at Africa Uncensored as a senior reporter. Africa Uncensored is an online media house based in Nairobi that focuses on investigative and in-depth journalism.
So we worked with Cynthia on an investigation last year into harmful pesticides that were being aggressively marketed in the global majority world. And we're going to be talking to her about how she made sure farmers who were getting sick from these pesticides were able to access the investigation. And then after the break, we're going to speak to Mazin, who you heard earlier in the episode.
Hello, my name is Mazin Sidahmed. I am one of the co-founders and executive director of Documented.
And finally, we're going to leave you with some really practical advice. Whether you work at a big legacy outlet or a small community newsroom, what are some of the things that you could do as a journalist right now to make sure your work reaches the people most affected?
From Lighthouse Reports, this is Backlight, a monthly deep dive into the world of collaborative investigations.
We're your hosts, impact editor Tessa Pang
and investigative reporter Beatriz Ramalho de Silva.
So Poison PR is an investigation that exposes a secret network of industry players in the agrochemical sector and their activities in pushing the sale of harmful pesticides in the global south and especially Kenya and other African countries.
This investigation had partners across 8 countries and 4 continents, and each piece had a very different angle. So the focus of the reporting in Kenya was around how pesticides that are banned in Europe are being pushed aggressively in the global south, particularly in Kenya, and are basically making farmers really sick.
Kenya was a really important country given that agriculture employs more than 40% of working-age Kenyans and more than 70% of Kenya's rural population. So we worked with Cynthia and the team at Africa Uncensored to make a documentary exposing this. And that documentary will be linked in the show notes.
Initially, I thought the documentary would interest our audience at Africa Uncensored. So our main audience is a tech-savvy individual who is active on social media platforms like X and who is conscious about current affairs. But then when I was doing interviews, going around the country and doing interviews, I came across farmers who knew nothing about these products. Remember, they are the consumers, targeted consumers of these products. So when we went to the field with my colleague who's Clint Obere and who was the camera person, we realized that we were asking questions and documenting stories of people whose lives have been changed by extensive use of pesticides like those containing paraquat. There are several here in Kenya. And even as I was asking questions, at the end of the interviews, they would ask me, what is wrong with this pesticide? Is there something wrong? Is there something we should be aware about? I realize these are things that even these sales agents and self-proclaimed extension officers have not been telling them. So they have just been buying a product in the guise of saving the cost of weeding, but they do not know the dangers they face later on in life. That kind of changed, and it also changed even how we were packaging the story. And we got to realize that some of them, even labels are written in language like Chinese, so they don't really know what they're getting themselves into. And that is one of the reasons that drove us now to go back to the communities and educate them on these products. Yes, we wanted to tell a story, but then we also had that moral burden of letting people know that.
The realization that farmers had no information on the dangers of these pesticides led to an interesting discussion amongst the reporting team. As Cynthia mentions, we realized there was a moral responsibility to take the information directly to farmers about the health dangers of pesticides. But we also realized that farmers might not necessarily see the documentary that was going to be produced. And that was because farmers predominantly speak in Swahili and the documentary was going to be in English. And as Cynthia learnt through her reporting trips, they often got their news and information from local radio or through attending community events. So that's when we decided we needed to take the documentary on a road trip.
So we went to how many counties they were around. We went to we went to Makueni County, we went to Embu, and then we moved down to Kisumu, we went to Busia, and we also went to Nakuru. That's 5 counties, which represents a larger population in terms of tribe and the different communities that are found in these counties. In all the counties that we visited, we got to invite, first of all, farmers, but there are also policymakers, like people working with county government. I remember in Kisumu, we had officials from the Department of Agriculture, from the county government of Kisumu. In Nakuru also, the county government of Nakuru sent someone from the Department of Agriculture. I remember in Busia, we not only met farmers and policymakers from the different government bodies, these meetings also attracted the attention of church leaders. I remember Kenya is a majorly Christian community. They say 80% of Kenyans are Christians. So usually the church is the main connection point between the citizens and those in positions of authority and also policymakers. In all the counties, we had that in common. The church leaders were available.
I should also mention here, we'd translated the documentary into Swahili as well. When we were deciding who to invite, we wanted to make sure it wasn't only farmers, but really anyone who could play a leadership role in these communities and who could pass on that information to people who weren't present in the room.
So Tessa, you were there as well. Were county government officials there too? What was that like?
Yes. So in Kenya, county governments are the level of government in charge of assistance and support of farmers for things like planting and weeding. So essentially, they're the ones who end up promoting these pesticides. And I remember in Busia, one of the towns we went to in Western Kenya, there was quite a lot of anger at the county official for allowing these pesticides to be used without protection. And that's because farmers in the room were seeing people they knew in their own village get sick, but didn't know it was related to pesticides. And the farmers in the room were demanding that the county officials change their policies to actually enforce protective clothing. Cynthia and I were chatting about that when we interviewed her.
Oh, yes, that was one issue. And the second issue is that, especially in Nyandarua County, Nyandarua County is in the central region of Kenya, and it is actually the breadbasket of Kenya. They were also worried about their lives, given that most of the farmers that were coming from that region are actually elderly. You find people from the age of 50 and above, people who have retired from working in the cities and they have gone back to the farms to practice subsistence or even large-scale farming. So there was that concern about their health. Some were very worried that they have been using these pesticides without even using protective gear. So those are the things that I was able to capture. And there was also the call for coming up with alternatives. Yes, we are going to ban these HHPs, but what is the alternatives? Because for most farmers, manually weeding their crop was out of the question because there was the issue of age.
So farmers wanted to know what alternatives they could use to pesticides, but that wasn't really on the documentary, right?
No, exactly. We realized that this would be one of the main questions farmers had when we went on the road trip. And it wasn't really something that as journalists we were positioned to answer. So we partnered with Biba Kenya, who are a network of grassroots organizations advocating for more sustainable approaches. And at the screening, they gave a presentation about what these alternatives were and actually brought some of the alternatives with them so that farmers could recognize them at the store.
I think that's a really important note here, that journalists don't have to do it all, but what you can do is think about what other organizations or groups exist that you can work with.
And screenings and community discussions are just one way of making sure that your findings reach people. But of course, they're not the only way. I think it's important to note here that journalists should think about how the community that you're reporting on accesses information and use those existing channels. Working with Cynthia on this investigation was really great because she actually grew up in farming country. So she knew a lot of the ways that farmers were getting information, and that helped to inform the strategy of how we then delivered those findings of the investigation. The story also had a personal rationale for her as well.
One of the weekends, I happened to take a break and go visit my grandma, and she had just used a herbicide. And so when I told her about these pesticides, right now we are chipping in more in terms of employing people to come and manually weed at home, because the downside is that you have to do it twice. So that means it's double the labor, double the pay. But we had a conversation with her and we agreed we would rather incur an extra cost in terms of manual labor, but eat food that is going to be beneficial to our bodies and also prevent her from developing these diseases. Because also given her age and the fact that she's hypertensive, we also wouldn't want to put her into that risk. She has done a lot for us, and it is our prayer and our dream that she lives long enough also to see the fruit of her labor. So this planting season, since we published the story in 2024, this year's planting season, it has been good. We have really been able to convince her to steer away from the herbicides, and it's working.
You're listening to Backlight, Lighthouse Report's monthly deep dive into the world of investigative journalism. If you want to hear more about our investigations, you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, lighthousereports.com. Or if you have a suggestion about a topic we can talk about or a person we can talk to on this podcast, you can reach out to us at backlight@lighthousereports.com.
So just now we were hearing from Cynthia about how she made sure farmers in Kenya heard about what she'd found out about these harmful pesticides and basically started a conversation in their communities about what could be done to protect their health. And now we're going to move on to hear from an organization that has actually been set up specifically to meet the needs of an affected community, which is immigrants in New York City.
Documented is a nonprofit news site dedicated to covering New York City's immigrants and the policies that affect their lives. And we felt that there was a real need for a local site providing consistent coverage of immigration because there was a real hole in how immigration was being covered during the first Trump administration. So you had general assignment reporters trying to cover this Byzantine immigration issue with no real understanding of what was going on. And as we were designing the site and trying to meet this need, we also wanted to ensure that the people who were reading the journalism were also the people who were affected by the journalism. And we decided that it would be really difficult for us to reach all the immigrants with limited English language proficiency. So we've really focused on people who speak Spanish predominantly and people who speak Chinese predominantly, as well as Haitian Creole speakers. The reason we picked those communities as our target is we felt that those are the people least served by the existing media landscape, that the way that news is being created right now really wasn't meeting their needs.
So, Documented is a really cool example of an organizational model that identified a gap in who journalism is delivered to and is designed specifically to fill this gap.
Yeah, and to understand how best to serve their audience, they did something simple but slightly radical, which is they went and asked people what they needed from the news.
We did something called an information needs assessment. So we actually went out to the community and asked, what do you think of the existing media landscape? How do you feel about the news and information options in your community? Where do you get your news? How do you access information? What kind of information is most important to you? And through those conversations, we designed news products that allowed us to have ongoing two-way dialogue with the communities that we want to serve. So for Spanish-speaking New Yorkers, we've built a WhatsApp channel where we send out a newsletter once a week and we encourage conversations, and we have a dedicated community correspondent who works on listening to people, trying to understand those needs and bringing those needs into the newsroom. For the Chinese communities, we work on WeChat and we publish a publication on WeChat and we foster conversation in the comments as well as through a group that one of our community correspondents runs on WeChat. And for the Caribbean communities, we run a Nextdoor account because that's often what we heard from Caribbean New Yorkers is that they were really interested in neighborhood news and they got their neighborhood news through Nextdoor. So those are the channels we work on, and we try and bring those conversations into our newsroom so that we're constantly having the input from the communities on the types of stories that we're covering.
It's an interesting flip of seeing your audience not just as consumers of the news, but as the drivers of why you produce what you do. And it goes along with this idea of journalism as a service, and that service should and will look vastly different based on who you're serving.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great way to do public interest work. I have to admit that before working on this episode, I had not heard the term service journalism before, even though hearing now from Mazin, this all sounds quite intuitive. And I mean, one of the main things journalists struggle with is connecting with their audiences. So to go out of your way to ask people where and how they will access news more, and then adapting your work to fit those needs is something that I would love to see more of. And here's what Mazin had to say on this flip.
I think the conceit and the way that I was taught to do journalism is really built around an idea that what is news, what is considered to be a news story, is defined as an objective truth, that you as a journalist either have good news judgment or you have bad news judgment. But what we consider to be news and what we consider to be important is actually often filtered down through a lens of a very specific type of reader. That we've actually been taught that what is important and what is news is issues that are really relevant to a often affluent, highly educated, politically connected class of people. The things that they're interested in are the most important news stories of the day. And that if you're writing for that class, then that's how you make your name as a journalist, because that's how most news organizations have structured their business, is really around serving that small subset of people. So because we've built this culture in a lot of Western countries that this is what is news and this is what's important, I think as journalists, we've also been trained to believe that. So I had to do a lot of unlearning when we started Documented, and we wanted to start really serving these low-wage migrant communities. I had to do a lot of relearning and unpacking of what I considered to be news. I think it will take a lot of challenging and questioning yourself and thinking about what the community that you want to serve considers to be news, as opposed to maybe what you learn in journalism school is considered news.
That resonates a lot. And a lot of the work Mazin describes is really just the equivalent of sitting down with people and talking to them and understanding what their news needs are so that you can do work that might actually have a chance to affect change or even, just engage a group of people that have been traditionally ignored.
Yeah, and I think one way of doing this is picturing the audience as not just a group of people, but as one person. So, say we're doing an investigation that's important for farmers in Kenya. I would have a farmer in my head and think about how we deliver information to them as an individual in a way that's useful to their lives. I think about what their day looks like. At what point do they have time to be listening to or consuming the news? And how are they seeing that news? What are their other concerns that are on their mind that day? Who are they speaking to? And all these questions you can answer by talking to farmers and asking them. And this could impact what you end up reporting and also how you deliver that reporting. The key difference with Documented is that even the inception of their stories are driven by what immigrant communities are telling them that they need. So I asked them how this works in practice for how they write and come up with stories.
One example would be what's happening in the immigration courts right now. One of the biggest changes since the Trump administration has come in is that they're really targeting immigrants at their immigration court hearings. So for people who aren't in the US, if you are eligible for deportation, you can appeal your case in the immigration courts, potentially win relief and be able to stay in the country or receive a final deportation order from an immigration judge that would make you eligible for removal and deportation from the country. So those court hearings, not attending one of those court hearings can have really devastating consequences for you. But the Trump administration has really targeted those court hearings as a place to remove immigrants. So on WhatsApp, Ramalho, our Spanish-speaking community correspondent, was receiving a lot of questions from people about, should I attend my immigration court hearings? A very complex, difficult question to answer that every week of this administration was changing. So he would bring those questions to the editorial meeting on Monday and to the team meeting on Tuesday and say, here's what I'm hearing from the community. What should we do about it? How should we cover this issue? So the first thing he often does, he'll reply to people's questions directly on WhatsApp. So that serves the community that we have there. Then we publish a guide on our website with that question. Should I attend my immigration court hearing? We'll publish it in English and Spanish. If we feel like it's applicable to other communities, we'll also publish it in Chinese and Haitian Creole. Often that will go on our site, and because our community is looking for it, the broader immigrant community is also looking for it. So on search, a lot of people will find that story. Through those conversations, he also learned about a scam that was happening where people were creating fake immigration court hearings and encouraging immigrants to attend them and charging them to attend them and saying that they were going to help them win relief through these immigration court hearings. So he was able to learn about those scams, publish that, and warn immigrants against those scams as well. So that's the way in which these kind of conversations translate into stories and change the priorities of what we cover in our newsroom. When we first started the site, we were publishing a lot of stories in Spanish that were just direct translations of the stories we were publishing in English, and nobody was reading them. But after we took on this approach of listening to the community and letting them decide what issues are important, the stories we publish in Spanish are routinely the most read stories on our site. So taking that community input can really foster better audience growth.
It's really interesting to hear Mazin talk about how this is good for audience growth in a time where so many news outlets are fearing that readership is decreasing and people are going to more non-traditional means like influencers to get their news. Making sure your reporting is meeting your audience's needs could be a great way to build back some of that trust and growth as well. Okay, so we just heard two examples of journalists and organizations that are doing great work to make sure that their work reaches communities who are affected. Now we're going to talk about four things that journalists in any media outlet can do to make sure that their findings are reaching these affected groups.
The first is to ask communities as part of your reporting how they get their information.
Yes, and this is an easy one to do because as reporters, we're speaking to people as sources already, anyways. So adding a few more questions about how they access the news can really guide how you deliver your information. Here's what Mazin had to say on that.
You just really have to set that intention as early as you can in the process. And I think you'll find it can lead to follow-up stories and people having more engagement, and just really deeply asking yourself, who is my journalism for? What do I want this to do? Who do I want to take this journalism and do something with it in the world?
The second would be to repackage your materials to fit with platforms that communities are already using.
If you want certain communities to engage with your story, you might also have to think about writing it in a different way or packaging it in a different way, translating it, thinking about how can I actually create this story so it's not just a 10,000 word piece that maybe the community that I want to read it won't read and never does engage with, but it's done in a way that is engaging and actually is native to the way that folks consume information.
For starters, I feel like we should make use of the emerging social media platforms. Kenya is very big on TikTok, so just even doing short explainers that can go on TikTok will really help. I saw that during the last year's Gen Z protests, where the younger generation of Kenyans were calling for accountability and good governance. They also are very big on WhatsApp. So if we can leverage on these platforms and also go back to also communicating in mother tongue and breaking down these technical languages into languages that can be easily understood.
Yes, so thinking about how you could translate the main essence of your investigation into, say, a WhatsApp message or a 1-minute vertical video. And that leads to the next tip, which is that often journalists might not have the language skills or the video editing skills required to do this. So you should partner with local media organizations and content creators that might already have those skills. And these people are not competitors for your work, but they do help you access new audiences and can make sure your story spreads as far as possible.
Partnering with local media houses, because Africa Uncensored might be popular only for those with access to the internet, maybe living in Nairobi and the big cities around the world. But we have other smaller media houses that speak to the communities in different regions. If we can be able to collaborate with one another and the local reporters or the grassroots reporters and broadcasters, I think that can really go a long way into.
Through the WeChat and with the Haitian community, we try and find influencers who can share our work and amplify what we're doing. So on WeChat, there are just individual accounts in New York that aren't huge, but they have meaningful followings within the Chinese community here in the city. We make sure they're aware of our work. We share with them when we have interesting stories. For the Haitian community, there are people on TikTok and on Facebook who are also influential within the local community. We also try and cultivate relationships with and make sure that they're promoting our work and sharing our work as well. So we try and use whatever methods are available to us to build relationships. And as I said, one-to-one direct relationships are going to be existential for newsrooms in the future.
And the final one is to be creative and try on the ground tactics, and to think about this as early as possible in your reporting.
Let's say you're reporting a story about Amazon workers at a warehouse, and you want Amazon workers to be the readers for that story. You want to make sure that they're engaging with the story after it comes out. Engaging and bringing in the audience team early on in the process and saying, hey, I really want to make sure that workers reading this story after it comes out can help you design some really interesting tactics. I know Grist did a postcard campaign about a story they had done around a factory that was having negative environmental consequences for the community around it. They actually sent a postcard with a QR code to the story to all the local residents in that area. Those types of tactics with real intentional and thoughtful planning are not impossible to execute.
Okay, so those are 4 things journalists can implement as part of their work to make sure their stories reach past an information elite bubble. Beatriz, based on our chats with Cynthia and Mazin, what would you change as part of your reporting?
I think it depends a lot from story to story. I really enjoy the idea of when sitting down with a community affected by a specific issue that I'm reporting on, that I could take time to ask them more about how they get their news or what format or packaging they would engage with more, because ultimately they will be a key audience of our reporting.
Yes, and I'm going to really double down on figuring out who the influential voices are in communities and make an effort to build relationships with them so that we can work together to get the stories out.
Thank you for listening. Next month, we'll take a break for the summer, but we'll be back in October.
Yes, and to keep updated with our investigations, you can follow us on our social media. Our Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and Blue Sky handles are at LH Reports, or you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, lighthousereports.com. All of those will be linked in the show notes. And if you're enjoying the episode, please do leave us a rating or send this episode to a friend.
This episode was produced and hosted by Tessa Pang and Beatriz Ramalho Silva. It was sound edited and designed by Spuvio. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Bye.